Sprains and strains are minor injuries that can occur in a workplace. However, depending on the extent of the injury, it can have a long healing and recovery time. First, observe the situation. If a fracture is suspected, then seek immediate medical treatment. In order to treat sprains and strains, you need to remember the acronym RICE, which stands for Rest, Ice, Compression, and Elevation. First, rest the injured part of the body, then gather your supplies. You will need to collect an ice pack, 2-inch bandage wrap, and vinyl gloves. It is important to ice the injury for 10 to 15 minutes every few hours for the first 24 to 48 hours. The next step is the compression and elevation stage. Place on your vinyl gloves and remove any clothing from the injured site. You may further elevate the injured site if needed. Lastly, compress the injury by taking your elastic bandage wrap and wrapping it firmly around the injury site. Once the compression bandage has been firmly secured to the injury site, it is important to continue the steps of RICE for 24 to 48 hours. Once again, these steps include rest, ice, compression, and elevation. Following the steps of RICE will help to decrease pain and decrease swelling from the injury.